it's time again to talk about some China stuff, and this time it's going to be video games. So everyone's probably heard that video games are now under assault in China, and this has kind of been going on for a while. So Xi Jinping was basically just hitting out against video games for a while. There's been multiple reports of him at different meetings and different publications, different events where he's just talking about how it's a problem. And you can go back for a couple of years, and China has been putting out all sorts of regulations about what to do with video games, how to regulate them. This is sort of stuff we've seen in the West for, over 30 years now. But in China, there was a big moment in mid-August when an official described video games as electronic opium. And opium's a big word for the Chinese Communist Party. It's associated with the Opium Wars, with national weakness, with foreign threats, with all sorts of things that you really don't want to be associated with if you're trying to do business in any sense in China. So that was the start. That sort of little, slip of the tongue came out in mid-August, and it sort of disappeared. Didn't know what was going to happen from it. Anything was going to mean anything? Was it going to be nothing? Well, at the end of August, the word officially came out that video game play by minors is going under the knife. So anyone under 18 is now limited to 3 hours of gameplay a week, and only on the weekends. There's no video game play from Monday through Thursday. And this builds off of regulations that have been going on for a while. So in 2019, there was some, what was it? It was basically nighttime regulation, so you couldn't play video games at night, between hours of this and this. And then in 2018, there was even like a phase where for 9 or so months, video game approvals, like new video games that would be allowed to be played in China, they just shut down for a while. So China had been thinking about this for a long time. And there was similar things going on in other parts of East Asia, particularly South Korea. And now here we are. But there is one important caveat to all of this, which is that this only applies to online play. It's really tied to certain online IDs. And kids can get around it if they just use an adult's or a parent's ID. And, that's where, the government's like, hey, you got to comply. You got to help us with this. It's good for your children too. We'll see. But kids are pretty crafty. So there is, there's going to be a huge market for offline play. I mean, all sorts of RPG. We might just see a shift in the market to all sorts of RPGs, strategy games, things you can do with bots, and you don't need the same sort of online connection to play. But realistically, I mean, online games are where the money is. It's where the interactivity and the investment is going. So this is all a very big deal. Also, we all know the kids are pretty crafty, so we'll see what happens. But this sort of regulation can be very, very difficult to deal with. I mean, it could really hit parents. It could hit all sorts of people if you don't comply. So it's not like something in the U.S. where it is sort of, oh, please help us. No, it can be much more rigid and authoritarian. So let's just really quick, we'll talk. I mean, the basics of this little episode today, we're just going to talk about some market implications of this, which is actually really brief. This isn't the most interesting stuff. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about what's happening with the gaming industry and what it means and people, and kind of vaguely touch on that at the end. But a lot of this is just about the broader social issues. Why video games? Why in China? What does this mean for Western companies or for people in the West who also think video games should be regulated? Do that, and then it gets to this basic question of, are games bad? What's going on? How does this, where are we from the 1990s crusade against violent video games? And then kind of, we'll just bring it back to really how to get back into the real world. What is the role of video games in the future? What is their really important function they played for the computer industry, for the whole IT industry for the last 30 years, 40 years even? It's a major, major component of entertainment these days, and you can't really dismiss it or deny it or try and have all these crazy stereotypes about it. It's a huge thing. So we'll talk specifically also just about gaming for minors and why minors and stuff, but that's the general course of what we're going to talk about. And the first thing is just the market implications of this. So game developers, platform owners, online players, I mean, the whole industry in China is reeling right now because of these regulations. Because the way it happens is that this doesn't happen. There's no public comment period. There's no notice that something might happen. You sort of have to read between the lines and get a sense for what are government officials saying. I mean, so that's why I referenced Xi Jinping said X, and then a random official, high-ranking official in a regulation division said Y, and then you think, oh, maybe that means something. And unfortunately, this is kind of like the old Kremlinology in the Cold War. You kind of don't know what they're thinking, so you're looking at all these symbols and stuff. And unfortunately, that's kind of what you have to do for a lot of these Chinese regulatory agencies, particularly if you're not in finance or areas where forward-looking regulation and the matching expectations for things like inflation or whatever is really a big deal. And well, I mean, the 1970s showed that, but that's totally different. In China, if you're just a random industry, these regulations can just come out of almost nowhere. And well, I mean, that's how it was before. After opening up in the 1970s, things really, they tried to be more open and basically participatory or transparent about what's going on. I mean, that was part of the way you sort of, well, you give baselines for domestic companies, but you also encourage foreign companies to actually participate in these things. But this is still not the norm for China. And if you're a random industry, this is kind of how things happen. So in China, it's a huge deal, and a lot of gaming companies are going to go out of business. A lot of them are going to be changing their strategies. A lot of them, I mean, a lot of market opportunities. So people in the U.S. are actually creating gaming divisions for high schools. So the high school in, south side of Chicago can play one up near, was it Ellington, whatever. One of those suburbs above Chicago. These are the sort of things you're seeing in the U.S. There's a whole track to making the professional gaming, the esports, all this more legitimate than it was. And in China, that's not something that's going to be possible anymore unless you're going to have basically carve-outs, perhaps for corrupt officials, you could say, or well-connected businessmen, or whatever the case may be. But this also isn't just limited to China. I mean, it kind of is, because the Chinese government, the gaming sector, is another one where the Chinese government has really worked to close the market to foreign companies. There are some joint ventures, and companies like Blizzard originally have done very well. But in general, it is Chinese games for Chinese people in China, built by Chinese companies. So that's kind of really what people are looking at. So if you look, anyone who's more playing the markets on this, you can see that there's been hits to Chinese game developers, not even just for this, but for a couple months, because things like this have been percolating for a while. But in general, this should be a major signal to foreign businesses about what business in China is going to look like. Is this really the fabled Chinese consumer market? Is it one where the government can arbitrarily regulate without any public comment or notice a whole industry, possibly giving it death blows out of nowhere? This is kind of where things are going. The way the Chinese state is trying to grapple with its challenges is not going to be this participatory, everybody get around the table sort of thing. And maybe that's not an effective way to do it anyway. That's a reasonable argument. A lot of the West is struggling with that kind of stuff. But if you're trying to do a sort of a consumer play in China, and this is what you have to deal with, on top of all the non-tariff barriers of just getting to the market, getting approvals, getting all the licenses, all the everything, it's gruesome. So that is something for just business people to meditate on, investors to meditate on, and people who are just curious about what's going on in China and what it means. That's where we're going to go now. But just for the market stuff, it's always good to remember that the Chinese market for a lot of industries are very, very different. They're ahead, actually. I'd actually say the gaming industry in China is just the way it's adopting certain patterns. You could say it's 3 to 5 years ahead of the United States, not in terms of the quality of different games or platforms, whatever, but just in terms of the way it's interpenetrating with a lot of different other sectors and with the sort of people in general. So that's one thing. But we're going to move on to the broader social issues at play, because this is actually where the really interesting stuff comes out. So why is the government doing this? Why is it regulating video games, particularly for minors? And there's a few reasons, and just to name some, there's an idea that gaming in general is a drag on productivity. So for kids, they're not studying as much, they're not performing to the extent they could to help rejuvenate the great Chinese nation. There's also this problem that gaming is very similar to addiction, or it's addictive. And well, if you look at the way a lot of video games are being produced these days, they are produced to have more and more addictive mechanisms. Maybe that's actually a sign that you should be regulating on that side and not so much on the consumer side. But it doesn't matter. This sense of addiction, of people becoming obsessed and just totally engrossed in video games, is real. And that's one of the things that good reason to try and regulate it. How you do so is always up to the country in question. But another one is just games, the idea that games form certain bad social habits or limit sociability. And in China, this is a bit different than in the West. I mean, China is more collectivist and it needs social integrity and stability for the country to not break into pieces. And so it thinks about it in a bit of a different way. It's not so much like, oh, Sally isn't learning how to interact with people. Billy is just sitting in his room all day. It's more like, are we allowing dangerous ideas and social behavioral pathologies to ferment unknown to us in different rooms and online and in these forums? I mean, that is where some of this goes. And for a lot of countries and companies and people, I mean, everyone is trying to use gaming and gamification to transform behavior patterns and motivate people and get them to do all sorts of things to make it a productive sort of activity. That's kind of the main thrust of where things are going with that. But there is a possible reason to regulate it on that front of just, hey, get people outside, basically. It's a bit antiquated, but so are some of the things the Chinese Communist Party thinks. So that's that. And then there's also an important thing that in China, game companies are major tech platforms, really major tech platforms. So in the US, we see this with the massive lawsuit between Epic and Apple. So people who don't play video games are probably like, what is this random company I've never heard of called Epic suing Apple for billions of dollars? Doesn't seem like they're on the same sort of caliber. But it turns out video games are becoming so ubiquitous and powerful that they actually are much closer than people think. But in China, it's way different. I mean, Jack Ma was the head honcho at Alibaba. And Alibaba's main competitor, not really, this is sort of like Facebook and Google, they're not really competitors, they're just equal sized tech platforms. Maybe that's the way I think about it. Well, anyway, Alibaba's main tech platform competitor is Tencent. And Tencent is a technology, communications, and gaming company, and its flagship product really is an essential app known as WeChat, which is used for everything in China. It is the app of a lot of things in China. And Tencent owns, in the US, it owns Riot Games, but also produces and makes money off of some of the most popular games in China. It's maybe the biggest Chinese gaming company. And as we saw with Jack Ma, Alibaba and Tencent are in the crosshairs probably more than anyone else. So Tencent was going to be regulated regardless of how anything happened. And this is sort of aside from the gaming thing, but this is a great way to start regulating Tencent. And you can see that Tencent knew this was coming because it is appropriately kowtowing to the government. It is saying, this is all totally justified. Of course, we need to support social stability. How else could we do anything else? Profit is so immaterial compared to this and the wealth and the health of the nation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where that is going. But these are in general just reasons to regulate gaming itself and not so much gaming among minors. So let's just talk about that. And really, it gets back into all the psychological and social research, mostly speculation actually, about what video game use does to children. And this stuff has been going on in the West. I mean, the West has been obsessed with it since the 1990s. Back then, it started with violent video games. They were going to help, make children more violent or something to that effect. And we've moved on from that. That's kind of, didn't turn out to be true. But at the same time, games have moved on and become just a massive force. Gaming is now bigger than the music and movie industry combined. It is so large that particularly older generations who aren't as just immured in the world of video games, they don't quite know what to do about it. I mean, gaming is the most lucrative, the fastest growing, and the most time-intensive hobby. I mean, digital hobby, but hobby in general among younger generations. So it's everywhere, and it is a technology that's moved. It's moved so fast that people and regulators don't know what to do with it. So, I mean, the government doesn't know how to think about it, let alone regulate it. And in the West, that means you get stuff like the U.S., where people and politicians will talk about it endlessly, and they'll just blather about it, but decry it and whatever, but they'll never actually do anything about it. And they just sort of use it in whatever electoral cycles are important, or to hit X demographic group or Y, whatever. It doesn't lead anywhere. It's actually East Asian governments that have been the most aggressive against this. Like I was saying earlier, Korea also, Japan as well. I mean, this is much more core there. I mean, it might actually be, the relation to the private tutoring sort of education thing that got killed in China. There's a similar thing here where in East Asia, in Japan, in China, and South Korea, you basically have one giant test that determines your future for corporate employment, for education, for everything. And there's a massive, painful, grueling sort of educational culture there. And whether you're going to a 3 to 4 hour private tutoring session after school to like add more school to your school, that's bad in a sense. I mean, it adds too much pressure to this whole process of getting education and getting school and getting training. And I don't know. I mean, this is a small historical point, but the worst civil war in human history was a war in China in the 1860s. It was caused basically by a guy who failed his basically the Confucian entrance exams for the bureaucratic administration stuff in imperial China. So the Chinese government knows that if you just have a world where there's no opportunity outside of passing a grueling hierarchical test, that already sets things up for problems. And in a lot of ways, gaming is sort of filling space around it and sort of around this central feature of Chinese children's lives, which is the testing and examination procedure to get through college, get through training, get into the great jobs. So these are kind of two sides of the same issue. I didn't talk about the the private tutoring thing last week, but it's a big deal. I mean, it was the major sort of thing that set off a lot of the problems that people are now perceiving in the Chinese consumer market. So that's a start. But the core issue for video games in particular is just they can become so all-encompassing, right? Like, let's say I was obsessed with movies. I'm just saying, like, let's say I was a kid and I was obsessed with movies. Well, you can only watch so many movies in a row, but with video games, the interactive element, the social element, I mean, all these things make it, people play for hours and hours. They can play for 10 hours, 12 hours straight, and it can knock out all other activities in people's lives. And during the pandemic, gaming just exploded. I mean, I think it saw like 3 or 5 years of growth just within 1 year. And the industry, I mean, this is why, you become bigger than music and movies and everything. I mean, it was the one activity that was still social that you could do while you were distant. I mean, watching a movie together through one of those apps that let you do Netflix, whatever, it's not really the same thing. It's not even close. It's not nearly as compelling. But you had, the pandemic really showed that gaming was becoming even more essential. So, I mean, in the West, Discord, which was originally like a tool used to to play video games together or to sort of know what your friend group, what games they're playing and to communicate with them while you play your game, they play their game, or you join together, you kind of see what's up. You have whole groups and tribes of people that are just on there. It has now exploded into a generalized communications platform. It almost seems like it is more compelling than the failed sort of Facebook Messenger or even, not WeChat, WhatsApp, and all these other ways we have of texting and doing all the endless texting apps we have. There's something about Discord that actually seems, maybe it's because it came from this gaming world, to be maybe the most comprehensive of those. And it's getting valuations and attempted buyouts by Microsoft or whoever that really justify the sense that there is something really powerful there. And it's related to how our norms of social interaction are so ingrained in the norms of video games now. Again, particularly for younger people, if you're a 45-year-old investor and you're listening to this isn't going to mean much to you unless you're trying to get into these sorts of industries and understand sort of what are the dynamics at play. But the gaming world is becoming everything. I mean, just among youth, and this is sort of an aside because it's slightly different in China, but this is makes it more relevant when you do the American example here. Discord is almost becoming the primary social platform for groups of friends. Like, you're getting to the point where maybe what the real social hurdle you'll see in college in the first 2 years of college might be, well, am I in the right Discord channels? Am I talking to the right people online? I mean, if we get another 6 months of pandemic-induced sort of forced, imposed isolation or quarantine, not necessarily quarantine, but just more limited social activity across the board, it pushes people in and farther and farther into these worlds that are where the most compelling thing again is video games. So yeah, let's talk about. I mean, gaming is going to remain a really big issue for a long time. And like I was saying, it's the most interactive, engrossing, and engaging technology probably that humans have ever invented. It is people who haven't really ever gotten obsessed with a game don't quite get it, but it is. I mean, they have a kid. Like I went surfing this morning. This little personal anecdote. I went surfing this morning with a woman who has 2 children who, both of them her kids just play video games all day long and they don't go outside. And it's the mother who randomly goes and does fun things while the 2 young teenage boys, literally just play video games all day, through the week, through the weekend. It's a very different thing. It's, again, this incredibly engrossing, engaging, and powerful sort of technology. And maybe it was in the 1990s, people were actually seeing what the potential was, or how far things could go. But all of this, I mean, this ability to just, for a certain technology to just override other interests just across the board, it makes it powerful. And to a government like China, that power can be a profound threat. It's similar to the power of social media to sort of generate celebrities, or generate buzz, or generate a promotional infrastructure, or generate brands and products and services just out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, purely through viral social effects. And something like this can actually circumvent the rather careful power structures and power hierarchies of the Communist Party. So there's a bit of something like this that went on with Bo Xilai during the sort of the conflict for the the succession to Xi Jinping's government. So that again, it seems a far field, and you talk about video games, and you're talking about the power structures of the government. These things are actually deeply interconnected, because you need propaganda control, you need attentional control, you need to understand what the mass population is looking at, what they're doing, what they're interested in. And when they're living in simulated worlds, that's giving a lot of power to the companies that create these worlds. So that is, I mean, that's the Tencent problem. Again, if let's say you have 400, 500 million people all playing some video game run by Tencent, if you're a communist party running a one-party state, you might think, hey, why don't we make this game? We make the game of China. This is our game. Why are hundreds of millions of people playing this this big companies game that kind of seems like a threat to our operation? That's something to really think about. So I mean, the way to sort of tie all this together is to really talk about, I mean, basically it's a plea for balance here. I mean, video games are insanely impressive and powerful and important. I mean, video games helped power the computer industry forward. A ridiculous amount of the innovation in the IT industry was almost entirely devoted to playing bigger and better games faster. I mean, all the graphics chips. I mean, the biggest U.S. Chip manufacturer is NVIDIA now, and they make GPUs for gaming consoles. That was their bread and butter for decades. And it's not just graphics cards. I mean, the number of things that are almost purely derived from helping to create virtual worlds is insane. It's basically the act of trying to simulate and create these virtual worlds has really pushed computing forward. It's been a major part of why we are where we are. So you're not gonna be able to get rid of video games. There's no way, and that's obviously kind of stupid. It's just a stupid idea. Although, I mean, the way things are going, we're only talking about regulating video games for minors. But in general, the video game question, this idea that there are there are massive platforms out there that you can push your population into virtual worlds and have them, make their way through pre-manufactured sort of stories, is a very powerful tool for governments. And there's sort of two sides to that. Well, it's like, well, you can do one of two things. You can sort of have a Brave New World thing where you make your population sort of docile, and you drug them, you make them complacent, or they sort of just play happy games all the time. They don't realize things are going bad. Or you can use video games to sort of more deliberately impact their beliefs and their values and their sort of behavior. That's much harder. I mean, you have to make really compelling games or whatever, but I mean, those are two sort of long-term things where you can look and you can think, hey, maybe this doesn't just stop at minors. Maybe the power inherent in video games is something that the Communist Party is getting to first because they're obsessed with stability. But in general, there's something very powerful here that is going to be a threat or a real issue for governments around the world. You could say, I mean, just the ability for people to just drown themselves in a video game or to live not outside of it is really not something we've seen with any other sort of technology. It's really unique, and there's something about it that is very unnerving to people, very unnerving to parents who see their kids just sort of retreat into a bedroom, or all their interests to disappear, for everything, the whole spectrum of their personality to just contort itself down to purely the video game and the couple friends they have that play it. That is something that we're all gonna have to think about. But what we need in general is, we need people who do more than just live in these worlds and play in them. You need people that make the games, people need to be taught to make games, to code, to modify games, and to use video games in a creative way. So companies like Roblox or games like Minecraft and games like that, they're already doing stuff like that. And so is the whole game modification community. They've been doing the same thing for decades. But unfortunately, right now, we have ever more money and investment going into making games addictive and to use. I mean, the place you really see this are gacha games, where they're basically incentivizing players to spend up maybe thousands of dollars on pretty shady mechanisms to just make them always pay to do every single little thing in the RPG or whatever it is they're playing. They're very disturbing and kind of dubious trends, like along that line of thought. But this is only just a piece of it. I mean, the whole video game question, in a sense, it's sort of a mirror image of the world that we live in. So we need to make the actual real physical and social world more appealing. You can't sort of just limit video games. It's not just about pushing people away from video games. It's about, pulling people into the world. There's, and in general, millennials and Gen Z, people under 30 and under, whatever, the 35 and under, the world may just not hold the same sense of possibility and promise that it held for earlier generations. I mean, the financial crisis and the pandemic are big blows. The ability for people to create wealth, the ability for people to get the education, to get the training, to get the social relations, the personal relations that they need to really thrive, these are becoming more and more difficult. And there is a lot of nihilism and rage out there. And in a sense, going and playing a video game is a better way to deal with a lot of these problems than to, I don't know, get violent or do something crazy. There's a sense in which, video games are a place where you can excel and act like a hero and grow skills and explore and meet friends and go on adventures. And that's it's powerful. It's something you actually don't get to do really in the real world. And it's how are you supposed to fight that? If the world is always going to be much more limited and pathetic and dreary and marginal in a sense than a really engrossing video game, that's a real challenge for not just governments, but for families and schools and communities and friend groups and everything, basically. If there's really nothing that can compete in the real world, you're just not really a fight you're ever going to be able to win. So there's got to be a lot more than just, hey, we got to limit and regulate video games. In East Asia, like I was saying, the tyranny of these tests, of the testing culture there for children, it pushes so many people into video games. In Japan, they used to push a lot of the more creative, imaginative sort into anime, into manga, and to those sort of creative pursuits. And obviously there's a similar thing in China to a lesser extent, but now video games are so dominant since the 90s that is really where almost everyone goes. And it's really, it's something that when you really think about it in that context and sort of that broader context of the world versus the video game, of the sort of simulated virtual world versus the real sort of decaying world that you sometimes feel like you're living in, that is a much sort of broader challenge than the way we're ever thinking about it. And so this is one of the things I like about China, where I often disagree on most of the ways it deals with basically every problem, but it tends to get to a lot of issues first because it's so concerned with stability and order and maintaining itself through a really tumultuous and difficult time. So it can help us see where the issue is, even though we've already known. Like, everyone has already known for a while that, hey, video games seem like they're taking over young people's whole lives in a lot of ways. They're not wrong. But we don't know what to do with it. We don't ever really get a context for it. And it's only when China really starts to move on things that we start to think again about what to do. And the traditional, or sort of the basic move is just to say, oh, they're overregulating, and we'll do something more vaguely libertarian, and that's going to be the basic breakdown of how we compare and contrast ourselves with China. But we need to be way more sophisticated than that. I think it's always about trying to find what is the sort of deeper issue going on in these sort of questions, in sort of social issues, that we can use China to sort of tease out. And that's really important. I think we nailed something here about what's going on with video games, because the actual limiting kids to this or that many hours, that doesn't matter. If you're sitting in a small apartment in a 20-story building surrounded by 20 other identical buildings in a small industrial city with 4 million people or something, and somewhere in central China, really, how are you what are you gonna do instead of play a video game? That's sort of the deeper question. And so like, I'll just end with that again. I mean, there's this deeper question of like, well, are video games going to be used for addictive fun? Are they going to be used to create more creative, productive people? Are they going to be used as a form of social control, whether through making people docile and complacent or through making them faithful servants of the state? These are the real questions. And yeah, I mean, I think that it's really just something to think about, because there's not really any answers to this, and it definitely, the way we framed it here pushes it a lot farther than what you'll see in the news and the way people are talking about this. Mostly, it's about how are gaming companies going to deal with this, or what should the U.S. do as well. But that's nothing. I mean, there's another. I'll have another video maybe about actually what's going on with gaming and where that's going. Not because I play video games, but because it is super important, and it is one of the most dynamic industries in the world. But again, just because you're dynamic doesn't mean you're not going in the wrong direction. A lot of things in crypto are very dynamic, but a lot of parts of crypto are going in a very, very bad direction. So we'll just leave it at that. But hope it was interesting to everyone. I mean, this is just a small sense of what gaming means, what it means to China with regards to its culture, how the government sees it, how it compares to the U.S. and our attempt to deal with video games and their perceived problems or their perceived influence for the last 30 years, and yeah, where to think about things, how things are going, and how to kind of better interpret some of the news about this. I hope it was helpful.